Well, hello and everyone, and happy Sabbath, and welcome back to the Biography channel. Now, in this series, I've previously covered the lives of Abraham and Isaac, and today we're going to look at the life of the last patriarch in that great trio of patriarchs who are often grouped together, Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. Now, Jacob, or Israel, was the father of the 12 sons, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that God chose to work with in particular for the rest of the Old Testament period. Now, Jacob's story is told to us in the second half of the book of Genesis. Now, the birth of his and his paternal twin brother Esau is told to us in Genesis 25, and his death and burial are covered in Genesis 49 and 50. Now, Jacob was the third link in the chain of God's plan to start a nation from Abraham. He was born, according to my tentative chronology, in the year 1790 BC. Now, he would move to Haran and marry his two wives, Leah and Rachel. Now, he would live in Haran for 20 years, begetting 11 of his 12 sons and a daughter in that time before moving back to Canaan. Now, following the extraordinary events of his son Joseph's life, where he eventually became Egypt's vizier under the Pharaoh, Jacob moved his family to Egypt around 1660 BC when he was about 130 years old. Now, he would then live in Egypt for another 17 years, dying at the ripe old age of 147 years old. Now, Jacob's story can be broken up into four major parts. His early years in Canaan, then his 20 years working for his uncle Laban in Haran, then his second sojourn in the land of Canaan, before his final years after he moves to Egypt. Now, in the first part of this look into the life of Jacob, we'll examine his life up to the time that he leaves from Canaan to find a wife, following the deception that he pulled upon his father. Now, in part 2, we'll examine his life in Haran up to when he returns to Canaan and reunites with his brother Esau upon his return. And then finally, in part 3, I'll cover the second sojourn in Canaan and his time in Egypt. Now, here is a diagram showing the patriarchal family tree. Now, Jacob's grandparents on his father's side were Abraham and Sarah, and on his mother's side his grandparents were Bethuel and Milcah, who lived in Haran. Jacob's parents were Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah's brother was Jacob's uncle Laban, who was the father of Jacob's two wives, Rachel and Leah, who with their two handmaids, who became surrogate mothers, bore Jacob 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah. Now, before we look into the life of Jacob, let's review God's greater plan in working with the patriarchs. Now, in our United Church of God booklet, The United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy, we read, God then set in motion a major part of his plan to offer salvation to mankind. Selecting Abraham was a crucial step in God's long-term plan to turn all nations back to him. The remainder of the Bible is woven around his plan to reconcile all humanity to himself. God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and illustrating his values and way of life to the rest of the world. End of quote. So we see here that God wanted his people to be a light on a hill to draw and attract the Gentiles to him. Now, Jacob's father Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Now, a few verses later, after Jacob and Esau are born, it notes in Genesis 25:26 that they are born 20 years later when Isaac is 60 years old. Now, going back to verse 21, we read, Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, there was almost 20 years where she could not have children before God intervened and she became pregnant. Now, we know that it was a tough tough pregnancy, and she sought God's answer to explain why this was the case. In verse 23 we read, "And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Now Esau means hairy, and his alternate name, Edom, means red. Now he got that alternate name of Edom, meaning red, from the bowl of red stew he traded the birthright for. Now it says here that Esau came out red. Now that may or may not mean that he was a redhead. Now the red may refer to the initial tone of his skin at birth, which may have become more pink or light skin later on. It then goes on to say in verse 25, afterward his brother came out, and his hand took a hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now Jacob, or Jacob in the Hebrew, means heel catcher. Now we'll later see in his story just how fitting this was, as it can mean one who trips up another person. Now that was written before the story of Jacob and Esau's birth in Genesis 25. Abraham died after Jacob and Esau were born. Now the reason for that is that Abraham died at the ripe old age of 175. Now we know that his son Isaac was born when Abraham was 100. So that means that Isaac was 75 years old at the time that Abraham died. Now as we just saw, Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob and Esau were born. Now since Abraham dies when Isaac is 75 years old, that means that Jacob and Esau are about 15 years old at the time of their grandfather Abraham's death. Now Abraham was buried in the same tomb that he purchased for his wife Sarah in Hebron in the cave of Machpelah, which means a double cave. In Genesis 25 we read in verse 27, "So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents." So we see here that Esau was the outdoors type, while Jacob was generally the indoor scholarly type. Though we'll later see that he is actually quite well skilled in animal husbandry and business when he goes up to Haran. Verse 28 then says, "And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." So we see here the seeds of a problem that will climax with the deception regarding who is blessed to become the next patriarch of the household after Isaac dies. We see here each parent having a favourite child. Isaac favours Esau, while Rebekah favours Jacob. Before the deception over the blessing comes an earlier incident revolving around the birthright or double portion of the inheritance of Isaac after his death. Now prophetically, when we talk about the birthright, we often think of the blessings of national greatness. Now Jacob and Esau here are not thinking about that long term. The birthright to them is the double portion of their inheritance from Isaac after their father dies. In Genesis 25, starting from verse 29, we read, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary.' Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright as of this day.' And Esau said, 'Look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me?' Then Jacob said, 'Swear to me as of this day.' So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way." Thus, Esau despised his birthright. So we see here that Esau was more concerned with his immediate need of food and put little value on his father's inheritance, which he would not see for years. Jacob, on the other hand, valued it far more. Now, no doubt his mother had told him about the prophecy that God had shared with her that Jacob the younger would rule over Esau the older of the two paternal twins who came out first. Now, this was no guarantee of the birthright inheritance, so he took advantage of a time of weakness for Esau when he is very hungry to bargain for the birthright. Now, in Jacob's defence, he did offer to buy it from Esau. He did steal it from him, and Esau willingly promised it to him for a bowl of red stew with lentils. Now, Paul in Hebrews 12 verse 16 warns us about not being a profane person like Esau. Now, Esau sold the birthright to Jacob, but the blessing was tricked out of him by Jacob's deception that we'll look at later. Now, in relation to the blessing, he was tricked out of when it says that he was tricked out of the blessing, Paul writes here that he found no place for repentance. Now, this actually refers to Isaac being not able to reverse what he'd been tricked into giving to Jacob. Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary has these things to say about the attitude of Esau that Paul warns us about. He writes, "The word profane here refers to one who by word or conduct treats religion with contempt or has no reverence for what is sacred. In a similar manner, the young, for temporary gratification, neglect or despise all the privileges and hopes resulting from their being born into the bosom of the church, from being baptised and consecrated to God." And he then goes on to say, "Now the promise respecting the inheritance of the land of Canaan, the coming of the Messiah, and the preservation of the true religion had been given to Isaac and Abraham, and was to be transmitted by them. As the oldest son, all the honour connected with this, which is now associated with the name of Jacob, would have been properly appertained to Esau. But he undervalued it. He lived a licentious life, he followed his corrupt propensities, and gave the reins to indulgence. In a time of temporary distress also, he showed how little he really valued all this, by bartering it away for a single meal of victuals." End quote. Now, when I spoke on Lessons from Abraham, I discussed the reasons to conclude that the family business of the patriarchs was not primarily raising cattle and sheep, which was only a small part of their overall business. Now, Abraham moved between four key locations on the ridge route that ran down the central highlands from north to south. Now, he would move between Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, and Beersheba. Now, all four of the cities Abraham frequented are on the ridge route, where there are crossroads shown in green here between the Via Maris, that goes along the sea, and the King's Highway. Now, Isaac, who is now the patriarch of the family after Abraham's death, appears to just concentrate his business in the south between Hebron and Beersheba. Now, when Jacob returns from Haran with his wives and sons, he will operate separately from his father's household as a patriarch of his own. Now, coming back to Jacob's early years, we find that when a famine hits, Isaac takes Rebekah, Jacob and Esau and the rest of their business entourage to Gerar, which is on that crossroad that goes from Beersheba to Gaza on the coast. Now, when I covered Lessons from Isaac, we looked at that rocky relationship that Isaac had with the Philistines of this area and how he eventually ended up moving back up to Beersheba. Now, after moving up to Beersheba, the next event that occurs is when Isaac is old and his eyesight is virtually gone, when he wishes to give Esau the blessing, which meant that Esau would be the patriarch of the family when Isaac dies. Now God had told Rebekah when Jacob and Esau were born that the older son would be under the younger son. God had told her that the second born was to receive the blessing of patriarchal authority. Isaac, now in his old age, decided to change this and give the blessing to his eldest son, Esau. Now Isaac, who is now virtually blind, asked Esau to hunt for him and bring him some savoury game food, and then Isaac would bless him. Now Rebekah overheard his plan and arranged it so Jacob tricked Isaac into thinking that he was his brother. Now Esau was a hairy man, and Jacob knew that Isaac would feel the difference in their skin and know it was Jacob. So Rebekah put goat skins on his arms and neck and prepared some savoury food for Jacob to take to Isaac. Now Isaac thought his skin felt like Esau, but the voice sounded like Jacob. Now despite his doubts, Isaac goes ahead and gives Jacob the blessing of patriarchal rule, thinking he was giving it to Esau. Now Esau soon after then brought savoury food to his father. Now in verses 31 to 35 we read that Esau said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your son's soul may bless me." And his father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" So he said, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau." Then Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, "Who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed." And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me also, O my father." But he said, "Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing." Now in Genesis 27:36 we read of Esau's reaction when he finds out what has happened. He says, "For he," Jacob, "has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." Now Esau says, "Is he not rightly called Jacob?" And as we have seen, Jacob means heel catcher, which can mean supplanter or one who trips up another person. Now we also see here a very clear distinction between a birthright and a blessing. Now what's the difference between the two? Now on the La Vista Church of Christ website, they give a very good explanation of the difference between the birthright and the blessing in the story of Esau and Jacob. They write, "A birthright referred to a person's inheritance. For most of the world's history, the firstborn child of a family would receive an extra inheritance from his father. The double portion came as a right of birth, that is, by the right of being firstborn. Now this is what Esau sold to Jacob for a bowl of red bean stew when he returned hungry from a hunting trip. The family blessing was a way to designate who became the head of the extended family when the father died. Now, like the birthright, the blessing generally went to the eldest son, but not always. A change in the blessing also happened in Isaac's family. Before Isaac's twin sons were born, God said, "2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." Now Jacob tricked Isaac into thinking he was his brother. Thus, Isaac gave the blessing to his second son, just as God said, even when he tried to go against God. End of quote. Now in verses 39 and 40, Isaac gave a prophecy about Esau. Now verse 39 is actually translated the opposite way in the King James and New King James versions compared to certain other versions. Now those other versions have the more correct translation, and I've added words here to give the correct intent of the prophecy. Now that prophecy says, "Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, Behold, your dwelling shall be away from the fatness of the earth, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, and it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. Now Esau's descendants lived to the southeast of the Dead Sea, near Petra and Mount Seir, which are dry, less fertile areas than the land of Israel. Now Esau's descendants were warlike, and often the people of Edom, that's Esau's alternate name, were under tribute to the nation of Israel and Judah. Now the prophecy about breaking out from under Israel's control came to pass in the days of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, when they successfully rebelled from being Israel's tributary. Now after Jacob's deception, it says in verse 41, so Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father at hand, but then I will kill my brother Jacob. So we see that Esau is determined to kill Jacob after their father dies. Now as it turns out, Isaac would live another 43 years, a lot longer than Esau would have thought at the time. In fact, Isaac was still alive many years after Jacob returned from his 20-year period in Haran. Now the story of Jacob's deception brings us to the first lesson that we can learn from his life. Now Rebekah and Jacob should have learned from the lesson of Abraham and Sarah regarding God's promise to give them a son. And we know from their case, Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands by using Hagar as a surrogate mother rather than patiently wait on God. And their compromise led to much inferior results. Now Rebekah knew of God's promise to give the blessing to Jacob, and under the pressure of Isaac intending to give it to Esau, she then panicked and took matters into her own hands. Now rather than trust God to make his promise come out in a just and moral way, she resorted to pressuring Jacob to lie and deceive Isaac. Now the resulting hostility between Esau and Jacob shows the inferior consequences of breaking God's law to have what God had promised earlier. Now under pressure, we can likewise give in to fear and take matters into our own hands, no longer trusting God. Under pressure, we can stop doing things God's way and break his law to have what we might yearn for. Now the first lesson that we can learn from Jacob's life is do not take matters into your own hand and break God's law to have what you want or what God promises. The ends do not justify the means. Rebekah is now very concerned for Jacob after hearing about Esau's desire to kill him, so she arranges to have Jacob sent away for a time until Esau's wrath passes. In Genesis 27 and 28 we then read, and Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like these who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, you shall not take out a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram. So we see here that Isaac sends Jacob off to Haran, and he even tells him who to marry, one of his uncle Laban's daughters, who he's never seen before. Now Esau heard about what Isaac said to Jacob about not taking a wife from the Canaanites, and knew that his wives displeased Isaac. He then took another wife, a daughter of his uncle Ishmael. Now coming back to Jacob, here's a Bible trivia question for you. How old was Jacob at this time when Isaac sent him away to go and get him a wife in Padan Aram? Was he 20 years old, 30, 40, 50 or some other age? Well, let's find out. Now we actually have to do a little bit of digging looking for clues to figure out just how old Jacob was when he left for Haran. and soon after married Leah and Rachel. Now we have to work backwards from when Jacob moves to Egypt to gather all the chronological data that we need. Now first of all, we're told in Genesis 47:9 that Jacob was 130 years old when he moves to Egypt and meets the Pharaoh. Now in Genesis 41:46, we're told that Joseph was 30 years old when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream and was made vizier of Egypt. Now we're told in Genesis 45:6 that when Joseph asked his brothers to bring Jacob to Egypt, that 2 of the 7 years of famine have passed. Now prior to that, we know from Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream that there were 7 years of plenty that preceded that. So if Joseph was 30 at the beginning of the 7 years of plenty, and we had another 2 years of famine, we know that Joseph was 39 years old when his father moved to Egypt. So if we subtract Jacob's age of 130 when he moved to Egypt, Joseph's age of 39 at the time, we see that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born. Now Genesis 31:41 tells us that Jacob was 20 years in Haran, which was comprised of 2 parts: the 14 years that he worked for his 2 wives, and another 6 years for the flocks that he acquired. Now Genesis 30:25 tells us that after Joseph was born, that Jacob asked formal permission to leave. Now Laban at the time convinced him to stay on longer, offering him flocks in return, which we saw he worked 60 years for. Now this very strongly implies that Joseph was born at the end of that first 14 years of dowry service, when he starts his extra 6 years of service. So we saw before that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born. And Joseph appears to have been born 14 years after Jacob left for Haran. Now if we subtract that 14 years from that 91 years, we come to the extraordinary conclusion that Jacob was single at a surprisingly old age of 77 years old when he left for Haran and got married. Now within 20 years, he'll go on from being single at age 77 to having 2 wives, 2 concubines, and giving birth to an entire football team. Now I guess there's hope for some of us older people, bachelors. Now we saw previously when I spoke about Abraham and Isaac that there was a large entourage that accompanied the patriarchs, such as the 300 plus servants born in Abraham's household that went with Abraham to rescue Lot. Now most of these would have originally come from the patriarch's original homeland in and around Haran. Now we know that Abraham's chief servant Eliezer is noted as being from Damascus. Now amongst all of Isaac's servants, there presumably would have been a number of attractive women that Jacob could have potentially married, yet he's still single at 77 years old. And remember too that Isaac was 40 years old when Abraham sent his servant away to also find him a wife. Now it's probably highly likely that Isaac and Jacob not marrying from any of the female servants of their entourage may have to do with what was considered culturally acceptable at the time. Now it is likely that they would have considered themselves a noble family and desired their children to marry those of another noble family. It seems that the servants were off limits when it came to marriage, with them preferring to marry within their own extended noble household back in Haran rather than any of the available women in their business entourage. Now since Jacob was 77 when he left for Haran, this means that Isaac was 137 years old when Jacob tricked him into giving him the blessing. Now Isaac would be 157 years old when Jacob would return. Now there's a lot of numbers I just threw in there, so for your assistance, at the back of the handout that I've given you for Jacob, there is this timeline here of the patriarchs that shows just how old each of them were at many of the key events in the lives of the patriarchs, which I'll let you study in your own time. And now we come to a pivotal moment in Jacob's life, what would be a spiritual turning point in his life. Now, Jacob travels from Beersheba on his way to Haran. And along the way, he stops at a place that up to this point in time is called Luz, but will receive a new name from Jacob after a vision that he has in his sleep. Now, he dreams about a stairway to heaven, not to be confused by the song by Led Zeppelin, which has nothing to do with this story, I might add. Now, Jacob sees angels going up and down the stairway to heaven, and the Lord standing above it. Now, God then speaks to him and says, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants. And your seed shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Now, just as he did with Abraham, God promises to make his descendants as the dust of the earth, and give to him the land of Canaan. Now, he promises that they will spread abroad, implying spreading further beyond the land of Canaan in all directions, and that his seed shall be a blessing to all the nations of the world. Now, God then promises to protect him and bring him back alive to the land of Canaan. Now, just as an aside, notice the cardinal directions mentioned in verse 14, where Jacob's seed would spread abroad to: west, east, north, and south. Now, we'll look further into where the descendants of Jacob migrated to in part 3 of the series, but it's interesting to note how those cardinal directions match the chronological expansion of the British Empire. West to America and the Caribbean, east to India, then north to Canada, and then south to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And it goes on to say, then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. This is none other than the house of God. And he called the name of that place Bethel. And the name Bethel means house of God. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I may come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, notice in Jacob's vow the word if. He says, if the Lord will be with me and bring me back, then the Lord will be my God, and I will give him a tenth or tithe to him. He makes a conditional vow. It's not ideal, but it is a good start in the right direction. Now, he then anoints the stone he used as a pillow with oil. Now, legend has it that this stone was in the possession of Jeremiah, and that he took it with one of Zedekiah's daughters to Ireland, and that this stone became a stone of scone that was fitted into the coronation chair that all British monarchs have since been coronated upon. Now, there's no way to positively prove that legend, but it makes me wonder if it was retrieved from Bethel later by Jacob or someone else, and if any of the kings of Israel were perhaps coronated upon it. Now, one recent archaeological site that's been excavated in the city of David in Jerusalem that dates to the time of the Middle Bronze Age, from Abraham to the time of the Judges, is a shrine that was discovered by Israeli archaeologist Elisha Kron, which has since been dubbed Temple Zero. Now, currently it's not actually open to the public, but hopefully it will be soon. Now, it's situated high up on the slope, close to the visitor centre of the city of David. Now, Middle Bronze pottery that was found there shows that it was constructed before David's conquest of Jerusalem. Now, it actually received what's called a soft burial around the time of Hezekiah. Now, that was only buried and not destroyed, and its continued existence between David and Hezekiah points to it not being an idolatrous temple, as Judah's kings would have destroyed it. Now, because of that, it has presented quite a mystery. Now, Elisha Cron suggests that it may have even been used by Melchizedek. Now, Elisha Cron, its central feature is actually the small standing stone that you can see there, which has olive oil residue on it, and you can also see an olive press in one of the nearby chambers. Now, the only stone that we know of that was anointed that far back in time in the Bible was the stone that Jacob slept on at Bethel. Now, Elisha Cron has speculated that this might be a small part of Jacob's pillar stone. Now, in the Church of God, we've led towards believing the legend that Jeremiah brought Jacob's pillar stone with him when he went to Ireland with Zedekiah's daughter to keep the throne of David alive, and that the stone of scone may well be Jacob's pillar stone. Now, if the chance that it is, that wouldn't rule out this also being a part of Jacob's pillar as well, as the stone of scone has obviously been cut and shaped so it can fit, and this stone here potentially could be an offcut of that process. Now, the legend of Jeremiah taking Jacob's pillar stone and Zedekiah's daughter to Ireland raises an interesting question about what happened to this pillar stone that Jacob anointed at Bethel in the intervening years between Jacob and Jeremiah. Now, was it treated as a memorial by generations after Jacob? Was it perhaps used in the coronation ceremony of any of Israel or Judah's kings? Now, there's one interesting reference in the story of the boy king Joash, who was hid and protected from his grandmother's murderous rampage and then coronated as king in 2 Chronicles 23. Now, verse 13 of that chapter, it says that when Athaliah looked, there was the king Joash standing by his pillar. Now, what was this pillar? Now, was it perhaps Jacob's pillar stone? Well, we can only really speculate at this time. Now, after his encounter with God in vision at Bethel, Jacob continues on his journey up to Haran. Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary notes that the distance is about 450 miles or 600 kilometres, which is a little less than the distance between here and Newcastle. Now, Barnes notes that if he walked 30 miles or 50 kilometres a day, he would have covered the distance in about 15 days. So now that he's on his way to Haran, that brings us to the end of Jacob's first sojourn in the land of Canaan. So we'll break there in the story of Jacob and continue the story of Jacob in Haran next time in part 2 of Lessons from Abraham. Thank you.